Hi, friends. You're watching The Naked Empire, and my name's Trish Roberts. I just wanted to firstly read a quote, if I could, before I introduce David Swanson. And it's from Glenn Ford's, from the Black Agenda report. Quote, U.S. imperialism is rooted in the rapacious expansionism of the slave system. George Washington envisioned the new nation as a, quote, rising empire, end quote. Jefferson spoke of an, quote, empire of liberty, end quote, meaning the liberties he enjoyed from the labor and sexual exploitation of the slaves. White supremacy legitimized every avarice of the new nation. The Monroe Doctrines staked the exclusive U.S. claim to dominate the Western Hemisphere, regarded as populated by inferior and, quote, mongrel, end quote, races, and, quote, exceptionalism, end quote. Washington now insists extends to the entire planet, end quote. So that was Glenn Ford from the Black Agenda report. And I just want to read a couple of, after the recent tragedy in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the subsequent removal of statues, etc., I just wanted to read some unfortunate quotes from the so-called founding fathers, and this is something that we need to consider. This is what the United States, in some ways, was based upon. And this is from President Thomas Jefferson, the papers of Thomas Jefferson, December 29th, 1813. He, quote, this unfortunate race, the original people of the Americas, whom we have been taking so much pains to save and to civilize, have by their unexpected desertion and ferocious barbarities justified extermination and now await our decision on their fate. So that was President Thomas Jefferson. And here's another one from him. Quote, if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. In war, they will kill some of us, we shall destroy them all, end quote. And lastly, just from George Washington to General John Sullivan in May 31st, 1779, quote, the immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin crops in the ground and prevent their planting more, end quote. So there's some really unfortunate quotes from the founding fathers. And so now I'd like to introduce David Swanson. And David is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for RootsAction.org. David's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. He hosts Talk Nation Radio, and he's a 2015, 2016, and 2017 Nobel Peace Prize nominee. And so I'd like to introduce you all to David. So hi, David. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you. I would add to that UVA alumnus and Charlottesville resident.
And David's just arrived, so he hasn't even had time to have a cup of tea, but he's very, very busy, but he's very kindly availed some time to talk to us. So David, I was just wanting to, I might just start off with that, the recent tragedy that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, and you wrote a blog post titled Creative Anti-Nazism, and I just wondered if you might like to sort of talk a little bit about that first, if you could.
Yeah, you know, here in Charlottesville, Thomas Jefferson is like a god, and you do not question Thomas Jefferson. I got, 5 or 6 days after the disaster there, last Saturday, I got an email from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia saying, we agree with Thomas Jefferson that an educated citizenry is part of the solution and so forth. This about a man who you just quoted advocating genocide and who owned human beings as slaves. But that's not questioned. And so last Friday, a week ago, the night before the big rally on Saturday, the racists went and rallied around Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, essentially agreed with them in their racist views, if certainly not in all of their views. And the good liberal defenders of UVA went out to defend Thomas Jefferson. You know, so this is where I live, in a, you know, a small college town, liberal town that's resented by the right wing, the racists, the Nazis, the fascists, who, you know, it's sort of a little island that votes Democratic Party, surrounded by a sea of rural area that votes Republican. And it's resented as, you know, not recognizing the sanctity of the sacred Confederate generals. These statues that, have started coming down all over the country, but not in Charlottesville yet. And so the mayor of Charlottesville today finally said something I've been trying to get them to say out loud and the media to report on for, you know, over a year, which is that the state of Virginia needs to throw out this law that bans taking down any war monuments, because that's what's keeping Robert E. Lee's giant heroic statue up on the pedestal in the middle of downtown Charlottesville. It's not because the racists have made it their rallying point, and it's not because the anti-racists don't really want it down. It's because the state legislature is a bunch of warmongers who have put through this law, as a number of states have now, that says you can't take down any war monuments. And of course, there's no law that says you can't take down peace monuments, and there aren't any peace monuments to take down if you wanted to. Yeah. So this is where we are.
All right, and David, I was just wondering, why do you think the police allowed the neo-Nazi protesters to bring guns and knives and other weapons to the protests? And you know, it's sort of, and why do you think they didn't keep them separate? Normally, I think, from what I understand, the police tend to keep opposing protesters sort of separate. They keep some sort of physical barricade from them, and yet they sort of just like stood back. Why do you think that might be in
Well, you know, Charlottesville is a small town. It had the local police and the local, you know, county and state police and National Guard and other, you know, assistance from elsewhere. But it's a small town that doesn't deal with a lot of rallies in the way that Washington, D.C. or New York City does more. And we've had events in Charlottesville over the years. We had a big peace rally one year with a friend of mine named Cindy Sheehan, who was doing a march like from Texas to Washington, D.C. And we told the police what we were doing and where we were doing it, and that there was going to be a counter demonstration, and we wanted them kept away, and we didn't want any trouble. And the police came and watched and did nothing. Now, in this case, it wasn't violent. It wasn't Ku Klux Klan or Nazis. It was just pro-war agitators, but they came with their giant megaphones and came up to inches away from us and drowned us out and were threatening. And Cindy went and hid inside a building, and you know, the police stood there and watched and did nothing. So here you have this sacred right in the state of Virginia to wear semi-automatic weapons like clothing and display them and march around with guns. I mean, this is, you know, considered in the deluded mind of Virginians to be as holy a right as the right to assemble and speak. And they're sort of mixed together, the right to assemble and speak while heavily armed, you know, which is not in the First Amendment, and it's not in the First Amendment merged with the Second Amendment. It doesn't, you know, it's not a human right recognized around the world or even in this country, but in Virginia, it sort of is. And so they allowed these people who were coming heavily armed, threatening violence, and very predictably going to engage in violence to assemble and speak as if that were their First Amendment right. And the ACLU and a local group called the Rutherford Institute defended them in court and won the right for them to do it at Emancipation Park, where the Lee statue is, formerly Lee Park, rather than where the city had said they had to go, which was a larger park outside of downtown. So there's a federal court to blame here. There's a local police to blame here. But then after they said it's okay to do it armed, you know, then they said, well, we're not going to interfere because it's not safe because they're armed. And you know, and this is militarized police armed for war with mine-resistant vehicles and tanks and helicopters and rifles. And they're saying because these people are armed, we won't, even the governor, you know, said because they were armed, the police wouldn't mess with it. So the police stood by and watched them beat people. you know,
Wow. Yeah.
and they came with all variety of weapons. And there's a grain of truth in the argument that people on the other side brought weapons too, but it's a grain of truth. It's not real
Mm.
truth, you know. It's not.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't make what Donald Trump says honest.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? It's just amazing. I just wanted to ask you about the book that you've written, when the world outlawed war, and it's I'll just quickly. It said on your site that Ralph Nader said it was one of the 6 books that everybody should read, and it's the forgotten story of the 1920s, how people created a treaty to ban all war. A treaty still on the books but not remembered. And war is illegal under the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the UN Charter and other laws, and immoral under proper understanding of the institution of war. And I had no idea. I had not heard of the Kellogg-Briand Pact until I, checked out one of your videos, and I thought, oh, that's really terrific. But anyway, if you could just talk a bit about that, that'd be great.
Well, this is one of those things that you discover about how history is taught, right? It's not just secret CIA schemes that were hidden that we don't know about. This was the biggest news story of 1928. You know, this was far and away, this was bigger than Charles Lindbergh's, airplane flight or anything else in 1928. It was the top of the news, the headlines, the big name celebrities of the world, right? And it was all the major nations of the world and their colonies, very hypocritically, but it got forgotten. It got erased. It got written out of history. And so what had happened after World War I was that those who had opposed the war and those who had been for the war were just universally united in wanting that propaganda about this is going to be the last war, the war to end all wars, to be made true. They wanted to have no more wars. I mean, there was a peace movement that had people from every party in every country, the bankers, the lawyers, the university presidents, everybody, and the weapons industry did not exist in the way that it does today. I mean, it was a serious monstrosity, but it was nothing to compare with what it is today. I mean, the farmers had more pull in Washington, D.C. They wanted the Europeans to buy more grain and fewer guns, and that's where the power was. So things were possible. And they tried to create this League of Nations, and it was a U.S. idea in part, but the U.S. Senate refused to be part of a League of Nations. They said, these other countries dragged us into World War I. What do we want them to drag us into another war for? And they tried disarmament, but the weapons companies were starting to get their act together, and they were quite effective in the bribes and the power plays. And these disarmament conferences just resulted in more armaments, which was, guaranteed to lead to World War II. Just as the Treaty of Versailles, the stupid, brutal ending of World War I, was predicted accurately by smart people to lead to World War II. But the peace movement finally sort of united the isolationists and the internationalists and the left and the right and the prohibitionists and the drinkers. They all united around, let's ban war. Let's make it a crime. Because there was this lawyer in Chicago who started this idea of outlawing war, and they called themselves the outlawists, and they want to outlaw war. And, up until 1928, it's almost forgotten. There were not nearly the number of countries there are now, because it wasn't safe for small countries. Countries were colonized, and there wasn't much point in rebellion and liberating a colony, because it would just be seized by somebody else. Seizure was legal, conquest was legal, looting was legal, pillaging and burning, arson, everything was legal if it was war. In fact, war was a tool of enforcing the law. If some country owed you money, this was, the argument for the U.S. war that stole half of Mexico in the 1840s. Mexicans owed us money, and that was legal. They owe you money, you steal half their country, right? And everything changed dramatically in 1928. After 1928, any conquest of territory was considered illegal and was undone back to the status of 1928. This was the turning point. And so after World War II, the victors, in a very unfair victor's justice, not two-sided, but, still, for the first time ever, prosecuted war as a crime. And they twisted it. They perverted it. They prosecuted aggressive war as if defensive war was legal, which, the activists behind the Kellogg-Briand Pact, not the general public, not all the senators, but the activists had been very careful to make it ban all war, not just, they said we banned dueling for individual disputes. We didn't just ban aggressive dueling and keep defensive dueling around. We banned the institution as barbaric. We're going to do that to war. This is what they did. Well, in Nuremberg and Tokyo, they twisted it and they said we're going to go after aggressive war. But at least they did, right? And there hasn't been a war among the big wealthy armed nations since. For maybe a variety of reasons, the existence of nuclear weapons, whatever, but pretty effective law, pretty effective prosecution. The wars are all on the poor nations and among the poor nations now. And so then they created the UN Charter and said, well, this will sort of be updated Kellogg-Briand Pact because the Kellogg-Briand Pact failed. It's like we have laws against murder and murder isn't gone. We still have the laws, I can't, the police pulled me over for speeding. I can't say, well, because I was speeding, your law has failed. So it's invalidated. I get to speed, right? There's not a single law in the history of the world that's ever been held to this standard. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is just dismissed and mocked by the few people who have ever heard of it because it failed because there was still wars after it. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the people who created it had no notion that it alone was going to end war. I mean, that's just a myth. I mean, that's just a slander, like saying Columbus thought the world was flat. They never thought that. They thought you would have to create systems of international law and sanction and nonviolent pressure and world governance to make war end. But this was going to be a start. You were going to stigmatize war. And in fact, war has decreased by many measures, especially wars by anybody other than the United States. It's decreased dramatically since the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the language of the Kellogg-Briand Pact was put into the constitution of various countries, including Japan's, under U.S. occupation. But the Japanese people made it their own and said, we like this, and the U.S. can't force us to undo it. We want to be a peaceful nation. And so it's quite a significant step toward the gradual goal of ending war, and nobody's ever heard of it. You can go to Kellogg Boulevard in St. Paul, Minnesota, steps away from Frank Kellogg's house, and ask people, why is this called Kellogg Boulevard? And you can't find anybody who has any idea. Even though the guy got the Nobel Peace Prize for it, and it's a treaty on the books today that bans war. So it's
Are there any Congress members that ever mentioned that pact, or, firstly, do they know about it, or if they know about it, do they ever mention it, or not really? No.
Well, my activist friends in Minnesota in Veterans for Peace got their local congressman, Keith Ellison, to mention it in the congressional record and to say that that August 27th is an important day, right? I mean, this was the day in Paris, France, where the French, first recognized the existence of the Soviet Union and flew the German flag and the flags of the world, and all the men, signed the papers to say they would never fight again, and it was all men, I have to say, and there were women among others protesting outside, but it was just sort of formal. I mean, this is a guy who's like the co-chair of the so-called Progressive Caucus, but was a big advocate for attacking Libya, a big advocate for attacking Syria. It's not. There's nobody who wants to treat war as illegal. I mean, the common understanding among the U.S. public, I don't know about the world, is that the UN Charter somehow banned war or did something bad to war, right? The common understanding among, lawyers in the United States, human rights lawyers, is that the UN Charter legalized war. And the UN Charter legalized two types of war, defensive wars and UN authorized wars. And half the time they imagine that all these wars the U.S. is waging are UN authorized, when they aren't. With Libya, they authorized going in to prevent a massacre that was never threatened. And then they turned it into overthrow the government and destroy the country. With all the other ones, including Afghanistan and all the ones that people imagine the UN authorized, it never authorized. It's just mythology. And so if they're not authorized, then the only question is, are they defensive? And if there are any wars that aren't defensive, they have to be the ones where a well-armed nation goes halfway around the globe and attacks a poor country. Those have to be the ones that are not defensive. And so all these wars are illegal, even under the UN Charter, much less the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But because the UN Charter has these two big loopholes, and everybody just sort of imagines, well, somehow it must fit in those loopholes, even if it doesn't, people just tolerate war. And so it's important to hold up the Kellogg-Briand Pact and say, hey, look at this law.
It's been completely normalized war, hasn't it? It's like there is hardly any. Oops, there's a bit of feedback there, I think. Can you hear any feedback?
I didn't hear it. Sounds fine to me.
Sorry. Oh, good. It's been like completely normalized, and it's sort of not only that, but politicians are now like openly in the US openly talking about regime change. Like there's been regime change for decades, and it's like I think 82 different countries have, the CIA has been meddling in their government, and it's been sort of an ongoing thing that the US empire goes into countries and says it's for humanitarian reasons, but it's really just about resources and hegemony, and it's just like a normal thing for the empire. But it's like now it's like politicians are actually sort of saying, oh well, we're going to go in and we're going to go in and change the regime in Venezuela, or we're going to do it in, it's the arrogance, to just be talking about other people's governments like that. And even the CIA, who are often the ones that are, meddling, even Pompeo was talking, Pompeo or whatever was talking openly about it, which is sort of unusual to be openly talking about it. That's how normalized it is now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's become more normalized. At my website, davidswanson.org, I've got a link in the top for a list of wars, and I do list there a study that someone did recently that found, I think, 82 elections around the world, that foreign elections that the U.S. government has interfered in, generally nonviolently. But I keep finding more to add to that list. But then there's all the coups that have been committed by people who were trained in the United States. So it's not even the U.S. government. And then there's all the violent overthrows of government by the U.S. military and by its proxies. And it's some 30 countries that the United States itself has bombed since World War II. It's become normal not just to treat foreign countries as playthings and toys and to talk about it openly rather than to make it CIA secrets, but also to talk about bombing other countries. I mean, there was a Republican primary debate last year in the presidential election, the party that nominated Trump, and one of the moderators of the debate asked one of the candidates, "Are you willing to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children as part of your basic duties as president?" And it didn't produce any major scandal in the U.S. news. It was just a debate question. But tell me if you've ever heard of any other country in the history of the world where that would have been a question in an election.
Yeah. I was shocked when I heard, that it was an admiral was sort of openly talking about nuking China. I mean,
Well, what happened a couple of weeks ago, if this is maybe what you're thinking of, is that reporters asked the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would you nuke China if Donald Trump told you to? And as a good soldier or sailor, he said, we must obey orders. Of course, I will obey orders, right? As if it's the moral, decent thing to do to obey an order that's illegal, right? So under Nuremberg standards, you have to disobey it, and an order that will result likely in the destruction of the planet for human life and most other life. Whereas somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, who's this unheard of phenomenon in the United States, that is a politician who's actually a peace activist, he was asked, would you nuke anyone? And he said, I would never use nukes. And he was just soundly condemned by the British media, but not the British public,
Yeah, right. Oh, well, thank goodness for that. It just amazes me, though, how that's spoken of, like, they talk about people as if they're nothing, human beings as if they're nothing. It doesn't, I wonder if they even think, when they say things like that, what that actually means. I mean, the level of it's just sort of incredible. And I wonder if you could sort of maybe give your thoughts on why there seems to be I don't know what it's hard to follow polls and what are real polls and what aren't. But why do you think that it seems like the Americans give a sort of there's a number of US citizens who give this sort of almost like unquestioning support of imperialist wars? It's sort of, there's hardly an anti-war movement to speak of, and it's just kind of like almost like accepted now. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, with somebody like U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham says, we're going to have a war in North Korea and thousands of people are going to die, but they're going to die over there, not over here. Yeah. That sets a model for U.S. citizens. They hear that and they say, oh, well, it's this 4% of humanity that matters. The other 96% we don't have to care about, and we can nuke them and destroy their country, and there won't be any nuclear winter because we were never told about that in our schools, because we have crappy schools, because all our money goes to more weapons, which we need to fight the evil people who don't matter. It's a sort of a vicious cycle. The U.S. public is not in some ways as bad as you would think if you thought that we really had control over our government, because we don't. Public opinion and public policy in Washington, D.C. almost never match up. There's some rare exceptions, but if you poll the public on the budget, the people on average want to take $45 billion out of the military, and Donald Trump wants to put $55 billion more into the military. There's like a $90 billion gap. If you poll the public on, do you want this war or not, where there's a choice, where there's an option of not having the war, they always say, no, we don't want the war. And if you say, do you want a war, or do you want a war and they've already tried all other alternatives, as if that were possible, as if you could exhaust, the nonviolent alternatives and be stuck with war. Well, then they say, yeah, well, I guess we'll have to have the war. And so you get these, obnoxious videos by Canadian comedians who ask Americans on the street, is it going to be necessary to bomb Kalawukistan or some made up place? And they'll say very solemnly, well, yes, I mean, we've tried everything else. There's nothing left to do but to bomb Kalawukistan, and I think it's a lot of it is lack of information, lack misinformation, lack of knowledge and concern about the rest of the world. I mean, when I go to other countries, they always want to know, what do people in your country think of us? Nobody in the United States that I've ever encountered in my entire life has ever given a damn what anybody outside the United States thought of them. But part of it is just lack of creating empathy, or what they call humanizing other people, as if you have to humanize humans. But Donald Trump supposedly was shown a video of CIA-backed killers in Syria killing a child. And this was useful in getting him to undo that policy. But has he never seen a video of what U.S. bombs and missiles and weapons and what nuclear weapons would do to children? Can we get him and others to see? Because when Americans see videos that people shot on their phones and put on YouTube of the police in the United States beating black people, well, they're in an outrage. They're not vicious racist sadists. They're outraged, and they put a stop to it if they can. We need people in the countries the United States is bombing. We need them to have cell phones and internet access, and we need them to understand what the U.S. public needs to see. I'm not trying to put the blame on them. I'm suggesting we get some tools to them that would, that would help educate the people in the country that's bombing theirs.
Yeah, because it's a concern to sort of see, for example, Senator Sanders. He's been an imperialist for a long time, and he kind of, he's been promoting anti-Russian propaganda. He's for the regime change in Syria. He sort of supports I think he basically goes along with what is, the both war parties and what they want. And yet he's held up by some as sort of a progressive, even though he's an imperialist and quite into the war sort of thing. And I wonder how, and that's he's seen as someone particularly special or standoutish. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Because, outside the United States, you look at the United States and you say, here's a country with 1,000 military bases in everybody else's country with this huge military and a half dozen wars at any given time. And this is sort of what the United States does. And if you look at the budget, over half of discretionary spending, as they call it, the spending that Congress decides what to do with every year, goes to militarism and wars, though nobody in the United States knows that. But in the United States, in political discussions, foreign policy is hardly ever mentioned. Wars are rarely mentioned. It's sort of an extra little topic off on the side, and people don't consider it. And so you have the right-wing party, on domestic issues, and the left-wing party on domestic issues, and the right-wing party wants to spend less money, but spend billions more on war, but we won't talk about that. And the left-wing party wants to spend more money, but even though most of it's going to go to war, we won't talk about that. And so, and Bernie Sanders sort of personifies where U.S. culture has gone over the past half century, because he was great on foreign policy when he was a mayor of a small town in Vermont. And he's gradually, very steadily gotten worse and worse and worse over the decades, to where now he justifies putting this F-35 airplane at the airport in that same small town in Vermont, even though the noise it makes is going to ruin the hearing and the brains of the little kids in the elementary school where the plane takes off over. And it's a plane with no legal or defensive purpose. It's for sneaking in and attacking other people's countries in a first strike mission. And it's disastrously, it fails, it crashes, it pollutes, and it costs enough money, to feed everybody on Earth and provide clean drinking water and medicine to the globe. And he justifies it because it supposedly creates jobs for the people who make the airplane. And because the United States government for, centuries now, has only spent money in a serious way on the military, people think that creates jobs, even though it actually eliminates jobs. You actually could spend it on anything else, on education, infrastructure, energy, or just not tax it from ordinary working people in the first place and have more jobs. People imagine it creates jobs. So I watched a panel discussion with Vladimir Putin and the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who told Putin, don't worry about all these missiles on your border. Don't worry about all this military buildup in Eastern Europe. It has nothing to do with Russia. It's a jobs program for back in the States. And Putin almost left. You have to left. Why couldn't you think of some other way to produce jobs? But people in Washington, D.C., they can't. They can't imagine spending money on trains or solar panels or schools. It's just not done. It's socialism. It's evil. Apparently it's more evil than killing lots of children.
It is amazing. I was going to ask you about the what do you think? First of all, you've got the Abolish the institution of war. That's something that you want to do. And so how do you with all the the corporate media propaganda that's continual, and also then the destruction of dissent, with all the various search and like Google and all those various ones sort of trying to prevent any sort of real news from getting through and all of that. And how would you go about sort of like developing, what's the primary barriers to a genuine anti-war movement, do you think, apart from those ones?
Well, I don't want to suggest that there are insurmountable barriers. I think it's entirely possible that we will succeed. We have to try. But the communication system, I think, as you mentioned, is a huge one. I mean, I was standing outside this funeral of this woman who was run over by a car in Charlottesville, and I was doing an interview with Al Jazeera, right, a media outlet from Qatar. And a man walks up to me and says he's from CNN and he'd like to know who I am. And I start explaining to him who I am. And as soon as he catches on that I would like to impeach Donald Trump, he turns around, walks away. You know, these are the barriers to getting on CNN or MSNBC or NBC, ABC, CBS. These are the big corporate, television networks in the United States. But you can get on them by creating colorful demonstrations and protests and creative actions in the streets in the United States. If you're in the way enough, you can get on there. But a lot of what we do with World Beyond War, and people can go to worldbeyondwar.org and read the website. We use the website to make the sort of the comprehensive case for abolishing the whole institution of war. And we do real world events where we talk to people, we talk to classes of students, and pass around sheets at the end to see, how people were moved and what they learned. And, they're moved dramatically toward wanting to abolish war when you explain some facts to them and some history and some of how we're lied to. And, so we do a combination of education and activism. And, you read a quote at the beginning about destroying the environment, destroying animals, destroying crops to starve people out as a tool of war. We're going to do a big conference in Washington, D.C. next month. People can go to worldbeyondwar.org. And we have someone coming from Friends of the Earth in Australia and people coming from around the world. And we're going to have environmental groups and peace groups together trying to build a stronger movement, because war is the top destroyer of the natural environment, and the big environmental groups are not taking it on.
Yeah. Actually, I watched one of your videos where you were saying how various green groups, they just basically ignore the militarism, which is destroying the planet. And also, I'd say militarism and animal agriculture are really two major destructive forces on the planet. I'm vegan, so I've got a fairly good idea of the extent of just animal agriculture, and putting aside for a moment the ethical issue of using sentient beings as resources. I mean, the environmental thing is massive, and they're like the two inconvenient truths: militarism and animal agriculture. For destroying the environment, and also I'd say like peace and veganism is. I just think it should be an essential sort of thing that goes together, but and I was just and there's this saying actually, which is where there are slaughterhouses, there'll be battlefields. I think that was a Tolstoy thing. But yeah, do you want to talk about the militarism and in relation to the environment and the sort of devastating effects that has?
Yeah, I wish people would pay a lot more attention to what Tolstoy had to say about war, because he was absolutely on point. And for Christians, I'm not a Christian, but for Christians, for him to explain to them what their religion should be, that is absolute refusal to participate in war. But to say that as long as there are slaughterhouses, there must be war, I don't think it's true in the way that a law of physics is true, right? I think it's possible that you could get rid of one of those evils, either one and not the other. But the whole ideology, fits together. This whole idea that it's okay for us to destroy people. And as most humans value people higher than anything else, once it's okay to destroy people, well, it's okay to destroy animals, non-human animals. And if it's okay to do those things, if it's okay to mass murder people because it's sanctioned by war, well, then what's the problem with torturing some of them? Torturing them is not as bad as murdering them. And what's the big deal about destroying streams and farms and forests? And, there are no more trees in Afghanistan. Who cares? We had the license to murder the Afghans. of course we have the license to destroy all their trees. What are you talking about? So I think, there is a way that you get away from eating animals, and you get away from committing war, and you get away from destroying the natural environment through a shift in ideology that takes us to a position where we say this is not our right, and enlightened self-interest, it's going to destroy us too, but it's not our place. We don't have that kind of power. We shouldn't have that kind of right. And the positive thing is that a lot of people, even in the United States, which is, at least per capita, the biggest destroyer of the environment by far, are very, and the younger they are, down to like 3-year-olds, the better, are really serious about wanting to protect the environment. But there's this gap when it comes to war. And in the United States, we have this government agency called the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which Donald Trump is radically defunding, although it's been corrupted and misguided for years. And they have the worst environmental disaster sites in the country. They call the Superfund sites. Well, 69% of them were created by the U.S. military. Right, the U.S. military is not just the biggest destroyer of the world around the world, but within the United States. It's the third biggest polluter of U.S. waterways after a couple of big corporations. And some of those, I think, maybe animal farming pollution. But it is the top consumer of petroleum. The United States military, just the military, consumes more petroleum every year than do most countries, entire countries, right? And we think about the relationship of war and oil as, they're fighting the wars for the oil. Well, they're not fighting the wars for the oil. They're fighting the wars for control of territories with resources that are worth a lot of money. They're not
Venezuela. They've got their eye on Venezuela,
like Venezuela,
with
like
the
the Middle East, like Northeast Africa. But which came first, the fight over the oil or the militarism? It was the militarism, right? It was the British military wanting to fuel its navy that led to this obsession with the Middle East and this pursuit of dominating the Middle East. So what we're going to do in September is, and you can go to worldbeyondwar.org again. We're going to take a flotilla of boats, of kayaks and canoes and boats, as people have done to stop oil rigs, in the northwest of the United States, and to the Pentagon, because the Pentagon sits right on the river, which a number of its Superfund sites have polluted dramatically, directly, the Potomac River. But the Pentagon's also the leading institution causing the rising of the waters, the tides that come up and down every day in the Pentagon Lagoon. So we're going to, put all the boats there with the giant banners with our messages, no more oil for wars, etc. And we're trying to get as many environmental groups as well as peace groups to do that. Now we just found out there's going to be a big racist rally elsewhere in Washington, D.C. that same day. So we're telling people, here's a positive place where you can make a statement that day.
Oh yeah, that'd be great to see. Actually, I look forward to seeing the videos of that. I was just going to ask you about how do you feel? Do you feel like that there's a possibility that, or any possibility, how with South Africa there was the BDS campaign against South Africa, and there's the current BDS campaign against boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and that's sort of actually starting to take hold, the BDS campaign against Israel, because you can tell they're starting to kick back, and that bill they tried to introduce to criminalize the BDS campaign against Israel. And I was just wondering, do you think there's any possibility or any way that one could have a BDS campaign against the United States until they stop this perpetual warmongering, basically? I mean, it's absolutely out of control at right now. It's just like every other day, it's like Venezuela, and then North Korea, and back to Venezuela, and data, and it's just all over the place. Do you think it's possible to have something like that? Do you see that as?
I think it is, and I think they're. By the way, they are still pushing those bills on Israel in
Right.
particular states around the United States. This is going to be a long fight, but yeah, I think it can and should be done. Just as I think we may want to start asking people to boycott my state of Virginia if it doesn't take down its racist war statues, as if some of the war statues aren't racist. But I think the nations of the world that take positive steps have got to pressure the United States to join them, right? I mean, there's one country on earth that hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of Children, for God's sake, and it needs to be pressured. There are very few countries that have refused to join in the International Criminal Court, the treaties on landmines, and numerous weapons that most of the world, and now there's going to be a treaty on nuclear weapons that the majority of the nations of the world are going to join and ban the possession of nuclear weapons. They need to pressure the United States, and so there's a number of ways to do that, including getting the U.S. nukes out of the countries that have them in Europe and elsewhere, and getting more and more countries on board, and building that treaty, and then moving for divestment from nukes because they're illegal and so forth. But the United States needs to be pressured, and there need to be UN resolutions. There need to be International Criminal Court and national prosecutions under universal jurisdiction, which Spain tried some years back with U.S. torturers, and the U.S. just came down so hard on Spain. And and when Belgium tried to prosecute U.S. crimes in Iraq, the U.S. threatened to pull NATO out of Belgium. And so there has to be a concerted, organized effort to resist the pressure from the United States.
Is that possible? I mean, like the UN doesn't really have any teeth. It just kind of it sort of can't counter the U.S. the global aggression and stuff. And I sort of wonder, is it even possible to sort of counter the because if it's inconvenient, the United States government just ignores it. You know what I mean? It's just I just wonder how is it.
I mean, I think there just need to be relentless initiatives and resolutions at the UN that will be vetoed by the United States. And then there need to be resolutions agreed to outside of the UN where they are not under the thumb of the 5 biggest war makers and weapons dealers in the world, which is just an absolutely upside down way to create something like the UN. I mean, we need a new or reformed global body that is not a collection of nations, but that represents people based on population. I mean, and we have the skills, the education, the communication, and the technology to do that. We just need to figure out the political will to make it happen. Localities around the world are far more advanced than nations in the world. So how do we unite the world as localities and then put pressure on the worst of the nations?
Yeah, and something, if one wants to change something to like a direct democracy, it's very difficult given, particularly in the United States with the electronic voting machines that can be hacked by the parties, forget Russia, and they can be, and then the infrastructure of the electoral system has gone into Homeland Security, and that's like putting kids in charge of a candy store. I mean, that's going to be as safe as, it's not going to be safe. So, I mean, you sort of wonder how, with a system that's like this, like the U.S. government, how can anything really, I mean, the DNC has already decided probably who they're going to put in for 2020, forget the primaries and stuff. It's probably Kamala Harris, or who knows, somebody, Ben Norton said it'll probably be Zuckerberg. He looks like he's aiming to be president one day. So, with a system like that, how can one actually, sort of do anything? You know what I mean? How can one change stuff with that sort of corrupt duopoly?
Yeah, well, it's not that it isn't a hurdle, and it's not that it isn't immensely corrupt, but
Mm,
it's not the only avenue to go down. And in the United States, the biggest lie we're told most effectively is that we are powerless, and the second biggest lie is, this is beyond any of the war propaganda, is that the one place where we have a teeny bit of power is in elections, which isn't
mm,
true. We have massive amounts of power, and very little of it is in elections. And the only way the world has been changed for centuries, I mean, since popular movements to abolish the slave trade and everything else decent from child labor, on through today, has been accomplished through creative, nonviolent
yeah,
activism and
yeah,
education and organizing and street theater and
mm,
sit-ins and strikes and pressure of all nonviolent sorts. And this idea that elections are the be all and end all,
yeah,
and if the election system is broken, well, then there's nothing you can do. Well,
mm,
how did we stop the bombing of Syria in 2013? It wasn't because of who was in office or who in the back smoky
mm,
rooms had selected them for office. It was because of
mm,
the public pressure brought to bear on them while they were in office,
yeah,
even though we had no ability to unelect them. Even though we had no
mm,
ability to impeach and remove them, we could
yeah,
still influence their behavior.
mm,
People go after Hillary Clinton for, they'll show a video of when she hated gay rights, and then they'll show a video of when
mm,
she's all for gay rights, and they'll condemn her
yeah,
for hypocrisy. No,
yeah,
that's what they're supposed to do. When the culture
mm,
changes for the better,
mm,
they're supposed to change for the better. Now, go after
yeah,
Hillary Clinton for a million other things that are absolutely indefensible, and she's got blood up to her shoulders. But for that, no. This is how
mm,
you change the world. You change the culture,
yeah.
and
Through
it,
education,
through
really, isn't it? Education is key,
education and
and
activism.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
part
yeah,
of the activism, it's not that I'm against elections. I'd like to have one someday. We don't have them.
mm,
Part of the
mm,
activism has to be about reforming the electoral system in a 24 different ways we can go into.
right, yeah. My partner's an American. She's got dual citizenship, and she used to hate having to pledge allegiance to the flag every morning. I mean, you cannot have an independent thought. You know what I mean? Like, and one wonders how can you reach children when they're indoctrinated like that every single morning. And
Yeah.
look at what happened to Copernic. Is it Colin Copernic? Just not refusing to sort of go with that. I mean, that it's a sort of a, you know what I mean? It's like a religion. It's a state religion, isn't it? Really, the whole flag and everything that
Yeah.
as Cindy Sheehan says, the bloody rag of empire. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I sort of feel so sorry for children having to do that every morning. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and this is a
Mm,
struggle worth having, and parents need to resist it, and children need to resist it, and we need to remember that court cases have been won that have decided that you cannot be compelled to repeat this fascist pledge as a little robot, that you can be a thinker and say your own words, but
mm,
I've been told they have something similar in the Philippines, and that other than that, the world is largely free of these sorts of pledges to flags. And I've certainly talked to many people in Europe who say that would be rejected as fascism if they tried that here.
right, yes.
I think it's got to end. And when I guess Kaepernick, I think is how you say it. But if
Mm,
somebody like Kaepernick takes a stand against flag worshiping, even if he's only doing it because he's against racism, and he goes out of
yeah.
his way to say I'm still for all the wars and the militarism, it's still, he has effectively challenged the religion of flag worshiping, and
Mm,
that needs all the support we can give it. It's absolutely critical,
yes.
because if you're going to worship a flag, you're going to end up worshiping and allowing and cheering for wars.
Yeah, I was watching that video you did in about Hiroshima. You were giving a speech about peace, and you talked about moral adolescence. That we're sort of still in this kind of moral adolescence and stage. And do you want to expand a bit on that?
Well, I had quoted a line from a book and a movie by Carl Sagan where the main character says, and it's intended to be very smart and wise in the movie and in the book, says about some foreign, outer space alien civilization. I would like to ask them most how they overcame their technological adolescence. I guess,
Right.
the invention of weapons that can destroy you. How did they survive that and get to technological maturity? And I wanted to make the point that there's no indication that technology goes through any such stages, adolescence and maturity. Technology just keeps getting better and better and worse at the same time. You get more and more delightful tools like the one we're using to talk to each other, and more horrible weapons that can kill us all. And, at the same time, and that will just continue forever. There won't be some period where technology just creates nice, helpful stuff that doesn't kill us, And so it's not a technological adolescence we're in, it's a moral adolescence, and whether that's new and whether we can overcome it and whether there are any indications of it being a stage in progression, I don't know. But it's a moral state, however long it's lasted and however long it will last, that I think is akin to what we think of as adolescence in social life. That is, it's reckless, it's thoughtless, it's looking at the short term, it's ahistorical, it's immoral, and so I think what we need is moral maturity. That Dr. King said we have now got guided missiles and misguided, I think he said men, I would like to say human beings. This is, so we have to take the focus off technological solutions to problems technology has created, which is, we got scientists at Harvard trying to figure out what they can put in the air to fix climate change. We've got to stop putting stuff in the air to fix climate change. So start looking for moral solutions, behavioral solutions.
Really, yeah, because all of this stems from each one of us, really, doesn't it? I mean, who's in government in many ways, to a degree. I mean, people have put them in there, really, and continue to put them in there, and also just in general life, what we're doing in our life, it reflects in the greater world, isn't it? So it's all about education and changing our hearts and minds about it, because the people in government are just going to do what they're going to do and serve their corporate overlords, and it's really up to all of us, really, isn't it? I was just wondering. I don't know if you probably already covered this. You did a short video about called "Why End War" and in 2 minutes, but also there was this other. I wonder if maybe you can talk about that later. But I was wondering about the drones. Can you talk a little bit about you did a little video about drones and stuff. If you could just share some of that, your thoughts, on drones.
Well, I don't think killing with robot planes is necessarily worse than killing with piloted planes, but it's a tool that U.S. politicians see as easier. They see it as preferable to use robot planes because they think U.S. pilots won't be shot down, and so the U.S. public that's been conditioned to only care about this 4% of humanity won't care about the war, won't care who's being killed. And so you've had this mythology built up under President Obama that there's a newer, safer, easier, cleaner, more humanitarian form of warfare. So when Obama was talking about his successful drone war in Yemen, which was, clearly leading in the direction it has led to in the disaster that is Yemen, people would say to us, well, don't you prefer a drone war to a non-drone war, to a land war, because at least with drone wars, nobody gets killed. And we say, oh, now wait a minute. Nobody gets killed. What is the point? What is happening? People are getting killed. That's exactly what a war is. But they mean nobody who counts. Nobody who's in the United States. Now, it's not strictly true. We've had blowback. We've found out where the U.S. had a drone base in Afghanistan because somebody attacked it. We've had high rates of suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, suffering among drone pilots. It's not as if there isn't any death. There's been suicides, but this is the idea. And then you've had this rhetoric from Barack Obama, who was just 1,000 times better at the rhetoric that the state wants in the United States than Trump, and he convinced people that he was only killing with drones where no civilians could possibly be hurt, so only evil monsters who deserve to be killed, and where they were an imminent threat to the United States of America, and where alternatives have been exhausted. They had tried to arrest them, but they couldn't. The only thing they could do was kill them. And all these sort of criteria, which he was just creating out of thin air, is nothing legal about it. But all these criteria would be met before he murdered somebody with a missile from a drone. And this sort of implication that they were criminals who had been indicted somehow in a court. Well, none of this, not a single one of these criteria was ever true for a single drone murder, much less all of them. They created this, the U.S. military played a big part in creating this Hollywood movie called Eye in the Sky, where they created this fictional incident where there's, these terrorists in Africa who they know everything about, their names, their biographies, and they actually are in this, dangerous neighborhood where you can't get at them, you can't arrest them, and they've actually got this teeny little drone with a camera watching what they're doing, and they're about to blow up a lot of people. Now, so they're not an imminent threat to the United States of America, but they're an imminent threat to a bunch of people in Africa, and so you have the commanders in the United States and in the United Kingdom making this very somber moral decision of whether to take them out with a drone strike and risk you might kill a civilian in the process, but they're going to kill lots of civilians. None of it has any connection to reality. And I went to the premiere of this film with the general sitting there and the director of the movie sitting there, and asked them, is there any connection to reality whatsoever? And they said, no, there isn't. And there have been a dozen great movies, honest movies, and theatrical, productions about drone wars that have been honest, and that's, and that most of these people, if not all of them, we know for a fact could have been arrested, and there was a preference for murdering them. There's been in, the vast majority of the cases, no identification who the people were at all, much less, careful labeling of them as civilian or non-civilian. None of them have been indicted for any crime. They're not, criminals being prosecuted by a missile. None of it is true. And it's on the contrary, it's disastrous. It produces enemies. It generates hostility. It endangers the United States or whoever does it rather than protecting. But people have been deluded. It's very, very tempting to imagine that, here's a nicer way to do war. What are you going to do? Not have war? Got to have a nicer way to do war. So it's insidious and it's dangerous.
Yeah, and it's amazing that Obama had that Kill Tuesdays list. Somebody just hands him a list of people. Just assassination without trial. You know what I mean? It's just sort of like, it's just disgusting. It's just, the whole thing is disgusting and abhorrent and frightening. I don't know, the moral decay of it all, to be able to just sort of, like a list of people and just, but the whole thing, the drones, the collateral murder thing, which happens on a regular basis, but, Chelsea Manning just happened to, reveal that particular thing. But that, watching that and watching those poor people just being gunned down from the air and blown to bits because, they were massive sized artillery and then killing the people that came or trying to kill the people that came to help them. That's a regular thing too of of killing people that come to the aid of people.
Right.
I mean,
right.
isn't that actually just, the whole thing's like a war crime, but isn't that actually against some sort of Geneva Convention or something, to be killing people that are trying to aid the wounded?
It is indeed, and I don't like to talk about war crimes because, as we discussed,
Yes,
war itself is a crime. But
yes.
if you're going to ignore the fact that war in toto is a crime, there are specific war crimes under Geneva Conventions and other treaties, and that's one of them. And the double tap strikes, where you blow somebody up and wait a little bit and then blow up those who are coming to aid. And so people don't come to aid, and loved ones listen to the groans of their children and their parents dying, bleeding to death, because they're afraid to go aid them, because they'll be blown up too, because it's not just on a timer. It's, somebody watching from a camera, waiting for them to come and then blow them up, and I think part of how we get to this moral depravity is through imperial power, for presidents who've been given more power than kings ever had, and a lot of how we got there is through a nuclear button. Once you've given a single person, and this was the one thing the U.S. Constitution got right from the start. These wealthy white slave owners who actually got almost everything wrong, they got this right. You don't give war powers, even the power for war with these rifles that you have to load and shoot every 10 minutes. You don't give that kind of power to a single individual. Well, now we've given to a single individual the power to blow up the world with a push of a button, and Trump is threatening North Korea and who knows where else with it, and his predecessors were threatening Iran with it on a routine basis. Once you've given him that, well, what's the big deal letting him push a button or tell somebody to push a button to send, little missiles from robot planes? What's the big deal? It's not blowing up the world, and he's got the right to do that. There's actually a bill in Congress now to say that presidents cannot start nuclear wars without Congress, as if it would be okay once Congress agreed, but really? It's a good step if it would pass,
There's been a lot of close calls over the years too with, there's that wonderful one about Vasily Arkhipov, and he's really saved the world in a way. He refused to fire that. But you might like to speak about that, David.
Yeah, there have been books and movies about it. Nobody in the United States has heard his name, but, and he's not the only example, but one of the best, that I'm familiar with. He was a Soviet sailor on a ship in the Cuban Missile Crisis who, was the last person that needed to agree before they would send nuclear missiles, and from this, Russian sub, and he refused. He said, not going to do it, and now we honor people who blindly and illegally and immorally say, I will obey any order. And we don't have any statues that I know of for Vasily Arkhipov to thank him for, not starting a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, which I think is, kind of a nice thing, Really? We can thank Kennedy and Khrushchev in a way for backing off from, their machoistic, run up to the edge of destroying the world. But here's a guy who really, his decision not to do what everybody wanted him to do, probably saved the world, and ought to be honored. That's somebody I'd like to. He came to Charlottesville just as many times as Robert E. Lee. That is 0. Why don't we have a statue of him?
Yeah, really. And I saw on the Real News that Colonel Larry Wilkinson was saying how, because Trump has basically given over, a lot of power to the generals and stuff, that basically they're just dropping bombs, sometimes just dropping them because, they have them and they want to get rid of them, sort of thing. And he's actually, in his presidency so far, there's been I think 20,000 or 22,000 more than Obama did in the whole 2016. I mean, Obama did 3 bombs every hour of every day for 8 years. But I mean, if he basically, Colonel Larry Wilkinson was chief of staff to Colin Powell, said that, if they are given that sort of power, they'll just, go ahead and just drop bombs and, drop and keep dropping them. It's like,
yeah, that's right.
It's
it's something of a military government, which, the military is supposed to be under civilian control. And we haven't had a military coup as some sort of, public event. But when a president, starts telling his subordinates in the military, do what you want, you make the drone murder decisions with the terrorist list of men, women, and children on Tuesdays or otherwise. You decide where to attack. You decide, and this has been a gradual process, right? I mean, the generals would publicly tell Obama how many more troops they wanted for Afghanistan, and Obama would negotiate with them in public and not fire them for insubordination, like he did finally when one of them insulted the vice president. Like that was a big deal. But, publicly setting war policy was not such a big deal. Well, under Trump, he's sort of the view that the military is the best thing since, rip-offs of black tenants in apartments or something. He just lets the military decide. And the things that he's been blamed or credited for deciding have been basically military decisions, and he's authorized them to decide we're going to bomb, or we're going to, drop this enormous bomb or send missiles into this airport and so forth. And it's incredibly dangerous.
And we still don't. I don't know if you heard, that the mother of all bombs kind of thing that was dropped in Afghanistan. I still haven't heard anything about the actual. They kept everybody away from that area, and I really would be very interested to see what kind of carnage happened in that sort of, with that bomb in Afghanistan. Have you heard anything about that? What actually, what the aftermath of that? Because it just sort of vanished, that gigantic bomb that...
Sure, yeah. In the days and weeks after, I did hear some reports, and a lot of it was speculative and, guesswork on how many dead. There was certainly many people must have died, but I haven't seen anything lately about it. But what a ridiculous, childish, and really murderous act to what a adolescent pissing contest that I'm going to drop a bigger bomb than you've dropped.
Really.
And
now I'm sorry.
I was going to say the Russians actually brag that they have a bigger one, but at least they haven't dropped it. Right?
Yeah, really. I was going to say too that Bannon, was removed from the White House now, and I think he was the only one that was actually against the North Korea, like attacking North Korea or whatever. He didn't think that was a good idea. So I don't know. There's probably a bunch of other reasons why he's gone, but I mean, found that sort of interesting because he was against that. I don't know if that's. I don't know if all of this North Korean stuff is just so that it sells more weapons to all the neighbors of that area and stuff. You know what I mean? I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was interesting.
That's a big part of it. Getting the weapons into South Korea. I mean, there's always good and bad in everyone, from Hitler to Gandhi. And a couple weeks ago, Bannon was proposing to increase the tax rate on the wealthiest of Americans, which you haven't heard that from anybody in Washington D.C. I mean, so you can always imagine, this must be why he's gone. But I'd like to see documentation, because it's entirely possible he's gone for the obvious reason that that there's a scandal about my town of Charlottesville, and Trump is getting enormously hostile and negative media attention from the big mainstream corporate media because of his statements on Charlottesville. So he's sacrificing somebody. He's saying, let's blame Bannon. And let's fire him and keep me.
Yeah. So I don't want to hold you up too much longer, David, because I know you've been rushing around. You're really busy and stuff. But and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about AFRICOM, because that's something that, what's going on in Africa. I mean, there's bases everywhere. Empire has bases everywhere, like 1,000 or something all over the planet. But Africa has got a lot now. And if you could just talk a little bit about that, if you could.
Sure. I've noticed, I'm not used to this medium. I noticed little text questions popping up on my screen from random people. It's always like, good in Hitler. So you're not allowed to say that, but I'm sure Hitler was nice to a friend or a pet or his garden sometime, right? Nobody is pure evil. But I think Nick Terse has done some great reporting on AFRICOM. The United States, unlike anybody else, has divided the whole globe up into commands, and AFRICOM is the command of Africa, though it's been based in Germany for years, and they've been trying to figure out where to base it in Africa. But the United States is, on a quieter, smaller scale than some other places, has been building up bases in Africa and weaponizing, dealing weapons. The United States is the top seller of weapons to Africa, as to the Middle East, as to poor nations globally, as to nations as a whole globally. Where do they make weapons in Africa? Few places, if any, right? I mean, I know Israel makes weapons. It's not in Africa. And yet, in the United States, people think of Africa as a violent place where people kill each other with guns. Where did the guns come from? Where do the weapons of war come from? Where did the carnage in the Congo come from? It's like the pushing of drugs on the Chinese back in the day. It's like the pushing of alcohol on the Native Americans. The United States and Russia and China and France and England and Italy and Germany, they push weapons on these poor countries. And the United States is in the lead in this sickening business that the Pope went to a joint session of Congress and told them they had blood on their hands and should end the arms trade, and they cheered for him, and then continued right along escalating the arms trade. And so the United States is dealing weapons and moving in its own military, as the solution to the problems it causes with its weapons, and it has just a horrific history of this, leading to no place good, and it's all sort of under the radar.
Yeah, just like, what the US-backed Saudi, genocidal campaign in Yemen, they're giving billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is the human rights abuses there, and what they've been doing in Yemen. And then the UK also, Theresa May has been doing huge weapons deals with Saudi Arabia.
Mostly selling, not giving, but still, kills.
Selling. Yeah, that's right, not giving. Yeah, but I mean, it's and that poor. It's Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, and now there's one child dying every 10 minutes from starvation and now cholera. I mean, and then you hardly hear a peep in the mainstream media about it. The corporate media. It's tragic, really.
It's incredible to me, and I have to believe that part of the reason nobody's talking about this crisis of starvation and disease, I mean, not nobody, but very few, has to do with its causation with war, with U.S.-Saudi war being the cause. Makes it, much less appealing as a topic.
Yeah. And I saw in one of your, and I've heard this before too, that nonviolent, campaigns actually are pretty much always more successful than violent campaigns. And that's, sort of a good thing to know,
Not always, not even close to always, but over twice as frequently as
frequent.
Campaigns
that's right.
that are mostly nonviolent. You have over twice the likelihood on average of succeeding. And when there is a success, it's almost always much longer lasting than a success so-called success that comes out of violence. They don't tend to be stable successes.
Yeah. So anyway, David, is there anything that you'd like to say? Like, how could people support your, campaign to abolish war? Like, what could they do to support that?
Well, World Beyond War, which is at worldbeyondwar.org, is started some years back by people in the United States, but has brought on members of our coordinating committee and coordinators in countries and localities around the world from around the world. And we will accept any level of participation. If you want to help start a chapter or make your group an affiliate or join with us on some particular campaign we're working on, from closing bases to divesting from weapons, or you want to really get involved and be on our board and help run the thing, we would welcome any level of engagement. So go to worldbeyondwar.org.
I think it's great, and I think it's so needed. Like there needs to be a really strong anti-war movement, and this normalizing war is just appalling, and it's just got to stop. We've got to start finding our humanity again and stop seeing this killing of millions of people, happen to be brown people, that's okay, as if they're completely different. You know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. Anyway, it's got to, something's got to be done. And there's really, the same in Australia, there needs to be a anti-war movement. There's really none to speak of. And I don't know, it's just gone off the radar. So anyway, Thanks so much, David, for taking the time. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate it. And it's been really great to talk to you.
Yeah,
so,
very glad to. You too.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll just say to people next week, Paul Street, he's a journalist and writer. He's going to be joining me at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time on Friday. So I hope you'll join us. And thanks once again, David, for joining me. And we'll see you next time. Okay. My name's Trish Roberts, and this is The Naked Empire. Okay. Well, thanks, David. Bye. Bye, everybody.